Welcome to Brain Decoded. This channel explores psychology through the lens of the brain. We focus on how thoughts, emotions, and behavior are shaped by biology, experience, and environment. Each video breaks down one topic, clearly, calmly, and without the noise. Let's decode today's topic. Trauma is often described as something that happens to us. But in reality, trauma is not defined by the event itself. It's defined by what happens inside the brain and body when the nervous system is overwhelmed. What makes trauma complex is that its effects are not always immediate or obvious. They can surface weeks, months, or even years later, often in ways that seem disconnected from the original experience. In this video, we'll break down what trauma actually is, how it affects the brain, the different forms it can take, and why its effects can persist long after the event is over. What is trauma? Trauma occurs when the brain experiences a threat that exceeds its ability to cope. This threat can be physical, emotional, or psychological. And importantly, trauma is not limited to extreme or life-threatening events. Situations involving loss of control, unpredictability, or prolonged stress can also overwhelm the nervous system, especially when there is no clear way to escape or receive support. Two people can go through the same situation, and only one may develop trauma. That's because trauma is not about what happened. It's about whether the nervous system was able to process and recover from the experience. In simple terms, trauma happens when the brain enters survival mode and never fully receives the signal that the danger has passed. The brain's survival system. To understand trauma, we need to understand the brain's threat response. When the brain detects danger, three main systems activate. First, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, rapidly detects threat. Second, the stress response releases hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. Third, the nervous system prepares the body to fight, flee, freeze, or submit. This response is automatic. It occurs before conscious thought and before language. In a typical stressful situation, once the threat passes, the brain gradually returns to baseline. The stress response shuts down, and the nervous system re-regulates. But during trauma, this shutdown does not fully occur. The system remains on high alert, even when the danger is no longer present. Types of trauma. Trauma is not a single, uniform experience. Researchers generally distinguish between several broad forms. Acute trauma. This results from a single, overwhelming event, such as an accident, assault, or natural disaster. Chronic trauma. This develops from repeated or prolonged exposure to stress or threat, such as ongoing abuse, neglect, or living in an unsafe environment. Developmental or complex trauma. This occurs early in life, often within caregiving relationships, where the nervous system is still forming. In these cases, the brain may adapt to a world that feels consistently unsafe, shaping stress responses, emotional regulation, and attachment patterns well into adulthood. These distinctions matter because trauma is not just about memory. It is about how the brain learns to anticipate danger. Let's use PTSD as an example. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is one well-known example of how trauma can alter the brain's threat system over time. In PTSD, the brain remains organized around the expectation of danger, even when the original threat is no longer present. At the center of this process is the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system. In individuals with PTSD, the amygdala tends to become hyper-reactive. It responds strongly not only to real danger, but also to cues that resemble the original traumatic situation. These cues do not have to be obvious. They can be sounds, smells, facial expressions, body sensations, or emotional states that the brain has learned to associate with threat. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which normally helps regulate fear and place experiences in context, often shows reduced regulatory control under stress. This makes it harder to distinguish between past danger and present safety. As a result, the brain reacts as if the traumatic event is still ongoing. This altered brain balance can lead to a range of symptoms, including intrusive memories or flashbacks that feel vivid and immediate, heightened startle responses and constant alertness, avoidance of people, places, or situations linked to the trauma, persistent feelings of danger, even in safe environments. Importantly, these reactions are not consciously chosen. They occur automatically as part of a nervous system shaped by extreme stress. From a biological perspective, PTSD is not a failure to move on or let go of the past. It reflects a brain that learned, very effectively, how to detect and respond to threat in order to survive. The difficulty is that the survival strategy remains active long after the conditions that required it have changed. Let's move on to why trauma stays in the body. One of the most important insights in modern trauma research is this: trauma is not only stored as memory, it is stored as state. Under normal conditions, experiences are processed and integrated by the brain. They are placed into context, given meaning, and stored as something that happened in the past. During trauma, this process is disrupted. When the nervous system is overwhelmed, the brain shifts its priorities. Survival becomes more important than reflection, interpretation, or integration. As a result, experiences may not be fully processed or organized into a coherent narrative. Instead of being stored as explicit memories that can be recalled and placed in time, fragments of the experience remain encoded at a physiological level. These fragments can include bodily sensations, emotional states, muscle tension or posture, patterns of breathing or heart rate, autonomic nervous system responses. This is why trauma is often described as being held in the body. Importantly, these bodily states are not memories in the traditional sense. They do not require conscious recall or awareness. Instead, they are patterns of activation, states the nervous system learned during threat. When the brain later encounters cues that resemble the original situation, these states can be reactivated automatically. The trigger does not have to be obvious or logical. A tone of voice, a physical sensation, a sense of unpredictability, or even internal emotional shifts can be enough to activate the response. In these moments, the body reacts as if the threat is happening now, even when the conscious mind recognizes that the present situation is safe. This disconnect between bodily response and conscious understanding is a defining feature of trauma-related reactions. It reflects a nervous system that learned to respond quickly and automatically in order to survive, and has not yet updated that response to the present context. What are the role of the prefrontal cortex? Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex plays a central role in how we experience and interpret the world. It helps regulate emotions, assess risk, and integrate information across time. This region allows us to pause, reflect, inhibit impulses, and place experiences into context, distinguishing between what is happening now and what belongs to the past. In everyday life, the prefrontal cortex acts as a regulatory system. It dampens excessive fear responses, supports flexible thinking, and helps create meaning from experience. However, during overwhelming stress or perceived threat, this balance shifts. As the brain prioritizes survival, activity in the prefrontal cortex decreases. This is not accidental. It is a biologically adaptive shift. Resources are redirected away from higher-order processing toward faster, more reflexive systems designed to respond immediately to danger. As a result, rational, reflective thinking becomes less accessible. Emotional regulation weakens. Impulse control decreases. The brain shifts into automatic survival mode. In this state, behavior is guided less by conscious choice and more by learned threat responses. This shutdown of the prefrontal cortex is not dysfunction, it is adaptation. It allows the organism to respond quickly in situations where hesitation could be costly. The difficulty arises when this pattern becomes persistent. If the nervous system remains chronically oriented toward threat, the prefrontal cortex may struggle to reassert its regulatory role even in safe conditions. Over time, this can shape how the brain interprets neutral or ambiguous situations, increasing sensitivity to perceived danger. The world may begin to feel unpredictable or unsafe, not because of present conditions, but because the brain has learned to expect threat. This helps explain why trauma-related reactions can feel automatic and difficult to control. They reflect a brain operating under survival rules that were once necessary, but may no longer be appropriate to the current environment. So, how does trauma affect daily life? Because trauma alters how the brain detects and interprets threat, its effects often appear in everyday situations, not just in extreme moments. After trauma, the nervous system may become more sensitive to uncertainty, conflict, or perceived rejection. Situations that are neutral or mildly stressful for others can activate strong internal responses. This happens because the brain has learned to prioritize safety over accuracy. As a result, ordinary interactions may be filtered through a heightened threat lens. Common patterns include hypervigilance, where the nervous system remains on constant alert, scanning for potential danger, emotional numbness, where feelings are muted or disconnected as a way to reduce overwhelm, difficulty trusting others, especially in close or unpredictable relationships, sudden anxiety or shutdown, often without a clear external cause, reactions that feel disproportionate, even to the person experiencing them. These responses are often confusing and frustrating, particularly because they may appear inconsistent or difficult to control. Importantly, they are not character flaws. They are not signs of weakness, immaturity, or lack of insight. They are learned survival strategies. At some point, these responses help the nervous system manage threat, unpredictability, or loss of control. The brain adapted to an environment where heightened sensitivity increased the chances of safety. The challenge is that the same strategies can persist even when circumstances have changed. As a result, the brain may continue to respond as if danger is imminent, even in situations that are objectively safe. In this sense, trauma-related reactions reflect protection, not pathology. The brain is doing what it was trained to do: protect. What science does and doesn't. Say research shows that the brain remains plastic throughout life. This means that neural patterns are not fixed. They can change in response to experience, learning, and environment. Studies across neuroscience, psychology, and medicine demonstrate that the brain is capable of reorganizing itself, even after prolonged stress or trauma. However, research also shows that trauma is not resolved through insight alone. Understanding what happened or why certain reactions occur can be helpful, but it is often not sufficient on its own. That's because trauma involves multiple systems at once. It affects not only cognition and conscious thought, but also physiological regulation, stress hormones, autonomic nervous system activity, and patterns of emotional response. As a result, recovery does not follow a single pathway. There is no universal timeline, no one-size-fits-all process, and no single outcome that applies to everyone. Trauma responses vary widely between individuals, shaped by factors such as the nature and duration of the trauma, developmental timing, genetic vulnerability, social support, and the broader environment. Science increasingly recognizes trauma as a complex interaction between brain, body, and context, not a simple problem with a simple solution. Where science is today, what is clear, however, is that our understanding of trauma has advanced significantly. Over the past decades, neuroscience and clinical research have made major progress in mapping how trauma affects the brain and nervous system, and how these systems can change over time. Today, trauma is no longer viewed as a personal failure or a fixed condition. It is understood as a neurobiological and psychological response to overwhelming stress. This shift has led to the development of multiple evidence-based approaches that address both cognitive and physiological aspects of trauma. Importantly, this does not mean there's a single cure or quick solution, but it does mean that trauma is increasingly understood, studied, and taken seriously within medicine and psychology. From a scientific perspective, trauma reflects adaptation, and adaptation implies the capacity for change. Trauma is not defined by the event itself, but by how the brain and body responded to threat. Understanding this does not erase the past, but it can change how we understand our reactions in the present. Thanks for watching Brain Decoded. We'll continue decoding the brain, one topic at a time.